Pressure from law enforcement changes how an organization moves. It forces caution. It forces silence. It forces discipline. But pressure from rivals changes something deeper. Tests identity. By the early 2000s, the East Coast was no longer quiet territory. It was no longer a stable foundation built on decades of presence and internal order. It had become contested ground. The Pagans Motorcycle Club had established themselves across key stretches of the eastern United States long before the national spotlight intensified. Their influence had been built gradually, chapter by chapter, state by state. But expansion across the country meant other major outlaw motorcycle clubs were pushing outward as well. And when expansion paths overlap, friction becomes inevitable. Territory in outlaw culture is rarely marked with signs, but everyone knows where the lines are. And by the early 2000s, those lines were being tested. Territory without signs. Outlaw motorcycle clubs do not publish maps. They don't file public zoning claims. They don't hold press conferences to declare jurisdiction. But the boundaries exist all the same. Certain counties, certain highways, certain bars, certain annual events. These spaces carry unspoken ownership. Respecting those invisible borders preserves stability. Crossing them, intentionally or accidentally, creates tension. As rival clubs began strengthening their presence in neighboring states, appearances in traditionally pagan-aligned areas increased. Sometimes it was just a patch spotted at a gas station. Sometimes it was attendance at a regional rally. Sometimes it was the establishment of a new clubhouse just miles from an existing chapter. None of it required words. In outlaw culture, presence itself is a message, and perceived disrespect travels faster than facts. Not every appearance was meant as provocation, but interpretation matters more than intention. And interpretation in a competitive landscape often defaults to challenge. The East Coast was no longer operating in isolation. It was operating under watch, both from federal investigators and from rival clubs measuring opportunity. Act 2. Reputation as currency. Reputation is the most valuable currency within outlaw motorcycle culture. It determines who can operate freely. It determines who commands fear. It determines who commands respect. For decades, the Pagans had cultivated a reputation rooted in territorial control and internal unity across the Mid-Atlantic and surrounding regions. That reputation acted as both shield and signal. It discouraged encroachment, projected strength. But reputation is not static. It must be reinforced. Motorcycle rallies became more than social gatherings. They were demonstrations of presence, visible proof of numbers and organization. Clubhouse events carried layered meaning. Attendance mattered. Security mattered. The display of colors, club patches, and insignia was not decorative. It was declarative. When rival members began appearing in disputed or historically aligned areas, it was rarely viewed as coincidence. It was interpreted as intention. And in an environment where symbolism holds weight, even minor incidents could be magnified. A handshake withheld. A stare held too long. A ride organized too close to contested ground. None of it existed in a vacuum. Act 3. Escalation. Not every rivalry becomes violence, but every rivalry carries risk. Tension often begins quietly, conversations behind closed doors, discussions among chapter leadership, strategic meetings weighing response versus restraint. Yet, on the ground level, friction can emerge unpredictably. Arguments at bars, confrontations at regional events, encounters on highways where two groups cross paths unexpectedly. In high-pressure environments, escalation doesn't require planning. It requires emotion. And emotion, fueled by pride and perception, can turn small incidents into larger conflicts. Law enforcement agencies were already closely monitoring outlaw motorcycle clubs nationwide during this period. Federal investigations into organized crime structures had intensified across multiple states. Now, rivalry added another variable. The East Coast was no longer simply under federal scrutiny. It was under competitive strain. Two pressures, one environment, and when multiple forces press simultaneously, stability is tested. Act 4. Leadership under fire. Inside any hierarchical organization, leadership defines response. Respond too aggressively to rival presence, and law enforcement attention intensifies. Respond too passively and reputation erodes. It is a narrow path. Club presidents and senior members were forced to weigh each decision carefully. Visibility could deter encroachment, but it could also invite investigation. Unity became essential. Chapters looked to central leadership for direction. Messaging had to remain consistent. Internal disagreements had to remain internal. Fragmentation invites weakness, and weakness invites challenge. In moments of rivalry, internal cohesion becomes as important as external projection. It was no longer simply about expanding influence. It was about preserving established ground without triggering consequences that could weaken the entire structure. Every move carried weight. Every appearance was evaluated. Every reaction was measured not only by rivals but by agencies watching from a distance. Act 5. The national landscape. The early 2000s represented a volatile period for outlaw motorcycle clubs across the United States. Indictments were increasing. Interstate investigations were expanding. Media attention intensified with every reported confrontation between rival organizations. Territory disputes were not isolated to one state or one club. They were part of a broader national recalibration of power among outlaw groups. The East Coast was one front in a larger, shifting landscape. As alliances formed and dissolved elsewhere in the country, ripple effects reached the Mid-Atlantic region. National dynamics influenced local tensions. Public incidents, whether confirmed confrontations or alleged disputes, were amplified through media coverage. Headlines hardened perception. The narrative of instability grew stronger. For the Pagans, this meant operating within a tightening frame. Any visible friction reinforced public and federal scrutiny. Any visible retreat risked signaling vulnerability. It was a strategic dilemma without a simple solution. Act 6. A turning point. Every organization built on identity eventually faces a defining question. Does it prioritize expansion or defense? Does it protect reputation at all costs, or adapt to survive long-term? For the Pagans, rivalry and federal scrutiny were no longer separate pressures. They were intertwined. Competition from rival clubs tested territorial dominance. Ongoing investigations tested structural resilience. The Norse imagery and symbolism that once represented unity and brotherhood now had to endure external heat from every direction. Identity can inspire cohesion, but it can also lock an organization into patterns that are difficult to adjust. The early 2000s forced recalibration, not necessarily publicly, not necessarily immediately, but internally. Strategic conversations were unavoidable. History shows that when territory becomes collision, outcomes are rarely quiet. Some organizations fracture under sustained pressure. Others restructure. Some retreat strategically. Others double down. Which path would define the next chapter? Ending. The East Coast was no longer a secure foundation. It had become a battleground of influence, less visible than open warfare, but no less consequential. Rivalry had emerged. Pressure had intensified. Every move carried consequences measured not just in reputation, but in survival. The next phase would not be defined solely by confrontation. It would be defined by adaptation, because in environments shaped by scrutiny and competition, endurance is not accidental. It is engineered. Next episode: Restructuring and Survival, How the Club Adapted to a New Era.